I actually answered the phone, was going to take the order, and the guy literally was saying GD every other word. Like, not in a mad, he was just, it was just part of his language. You know, I take the order, and he kept doing it, and I thought, I need to say something. And so I did. I was like, no, look, appreciate your order, but the God that you're using that phrase with, we actually believe he's real and we worship him. So I confronted him at the end of the conversation, and he just didn't say anything, just got quiet. He's like, all right. So I hang up, and then I go back out to the shop or whatever. Well, then he called back. Well, Phil answered the phone, which is unusual, but he did every once in a while.
You know, the guy that called me and said and used God's name in vain about 5 times, ordering a duck call. And I was thinking, man, I said, look, why you keep cursing the only one that can save you from death? Well, there was just silence. About the 5th time, he said, GD something. I thought, why do you keep cursing him? Well, there was silence on the phone. He said, hey, you got my order? I said, I got your order. So he hangs up. 10 minutes goes by. The phone rings again. He said, hey. I said, yep. He said, it's me again. He said, I've never thought about that. I said, well, you curse God like he's done something to you. I said, man, I said, he can save you, give you eternal life. I said, you know what you ought to do? And I looked down at his sheet right quick. I said, you ought to drive over here. I said, it's about, from where you are, about 8, 9 hours. I said, you ought to drive over here, and I'll tell you a story about the one you're cursing. I said, you may change your mind. He said, well, I might do that, Hoss. I said, you ought to. Boom. A week goes by, and the knock on the door, and the dude steps in. He said, you know who I am? I said, he's a husky. I said, no, I don't believe I ever met you. He said, I'm the one that was cursing God. I said, so you did come? He said, I got to know. I said, come on in here. Look,
like
he was
Dirty Harry,
converted. 17 years went by. I'm speaking over there in the state he was from. And the preacher says, somebody walked up there and he said, Phil, you remember the dude that was cursing God on the phone? I said, cursing God on the phone? I said, I remember that way back. I said, that's been a long time ago, 15, 20 years ago. He said, he's down there waiting on you, wanting to talk to you. He heard you was coming to this church tonight. He said, by the way, he's one of the leaders of this church now. Mm-hmm. I said, my point is, just like you and that girl, you never know.
Well, I mean,
you never know how God works in your life.